series of sermons that I've been preaching, you really can't preach this series without looking at this text. We've been talking about, is it your time and is it your moment?
All right.
Last week we looked at Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, the one who went, and God told him in the very first chapter how hard it was going to be. He already told him in chapter 1 of the book of Jeremiah that they're going to look at you funny. They're going to treat you funny. And your job is going to be difficult. And Jeremiah went and preached to the nation of Israel during the Babylonian captivity. It was a very difficult time in the life of the nation. This was not a time of prosperity, but it was a time of judgment. Jeremiah had to give a difficult message during a difficult time. Jeremiah was a man who had a heart for God, but had a heart for the people. He had a stern voice, but a soft heart. And he did not weep because of the difficulty of his assignment, but he wept because of the condition of the people's hearts. They wanted to hear good news when there was none to give. They wanted to hear that God was going to shorten the Babylonian captivity, that it would soon be over. And Jeremiah, being a priest and prophet, could not give them that news. But there were other false prophets in Jeremiah's time that wanted to tell the people that it was going to be okay. That God was going to shorten his judgment. God was going to shorten the punishment. But Jeremiah stuck to the message that you're going to have to suffer this out. But what I love about Jeremiah, he was a good news prophet in a bad time for the nation. The good news was God wasn't going to get you out of this, but God was going to help you make it through this. And that's the good news. Which in ain't going to be over no time soon. But the good news is God is going to help you through it. He ain't going to get you out of it. And that was the message of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah took advantage of his moment, his time. Jeremiah was a man who was preordained, sanctified, and set apart for the time in which God called him. And it was a difficult time in the history of the Jewish people, and Jeremiah was faithful. Faithful to his call, faithful to the message that God had given him. But I want to look this morning at the book of Esther. You can't even talk about this subject, and I preached this before, without looking at this text. Because this particular text in the book of Esther, we don't know who wrote it. The unknown author of this particular book wrote this story, and it primarily has 4 characters. King Ahasuerus, and Vashti the queen, Haman, Mordecai, and Esther. Vashti queen, Vashti is not significant after she appears, but for just a moment. And then she disappears from the story. For whatever reason, she refused to present herself to the king and to the king's companies, men, princes, and his military cabinet, and he disqualified her or dismissed her. And then the rest of the book of Esther is about these 4 characters. The king Xerxes the first, we know him in the text as the king that saw a beautiful woman we see Haman, the man who hated the Jewish people. He hated Mordecai. Mordecai was the uncle, the adopted father of Esther. You have to really read the story to get the lessons of the story. If you read the book of Esther, a couple of things will come to your attention. One of the reasons why the historians and theologians, the councils that met to determine the canon of Scripture did not want to include the book of Esther in the Bible was because in the book of Esther, the name of God is never mentioned. You can read all of the chapters in the book of Esther, and not one time is the name of God mentioned in the whole book. There is not any reference to the name of God. The word God is not in it. The word Lord is not in it. The word Jehovah is not in it. The word Yeshua is not in it. No mention of God in the whole text of Scripture that we read. You can search all of these verses and chapters in the book of Esther, and not in one verse, one chapter is the name of God mentioned. Mordecai does not reference God. Esther does not reference God. Nobody in the text references God. And so many of the theologians and scholars who were deciding what the canon of Scripture was going to be, and those are the books that would be included in the Bible in which you and I read, suggested that the book of Esther did need to be put in the Bible. But then other scholars determined that God was in this book. You have to really read it closely. And really to understand the book of Esther, you have to understand the doctrine of God. The doctrine of God is that God is sovereign. That God is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. That God has a sovereign will. God has a providential will. You have to understand who God is and how God operates. God is not like us. God operates in such a way that it confounds and confuses men and women. Sometimes God operates, and he operates in such a subtle way. God does not have to make himself known when he operates. Sometimes God can operate in such a way that it is mysterious and peculiar to men. In order to understand the book of Esther, you got to understand who God is. God is not like you and I. God does not have to have his hands in something in order to control something. God can operate. And so scholars and theologians decided that God was very much in this book. You could not identify him. They might have never called his name, but God was at work. He was at work because it was a threat to the Jewish nation. The Jewish nation had been released from their 70-year captivity in Babylon, and the Jews were given the opportunity to go back to their homeland. They were given their freedom to go back, but some of the Jews decided not to go back to Jerusalem. They decided not to go back to their homeland. Some of them stayed in Babylon. And the two characters that we are going to talk about, Mordecai and Esther, were two who chose not to go back to their homeland, but they decided to stay in Babylon or Persia. They decided not to go back to their homeland. Some of the Jews dispersed, but they did not go back to Jerusalem. And we pick up the story that these two persons decided to stay back. They did not go to their homeland. And my brothers and sisters, this story is significant because of the ethnicity of the people who were threatened in the text. You do know it was the Jewish people who Haman decided he was going to destroy. He wanted to destroy the Jewish people because he hated Mordecai. He hated Mordecai because Mordecai refused to bow down and worship him. You remember, if you read the entire story, King Agenias had literally promoted Haman. He had literally given Haman this position of power. And everybody in the kingdom of Ahasuerus literally bowed down to Haman. But Mordecai sat at the gates of the city, and one day Haman was coming into the king's palace, and Mordecai was sitting at the gate of the city, and when he passed by, everybody was bowing to Haman. But when Haman came to Mordecai, Mordecai refused to bow. And there was a seated hatred to this particular incident that just fueled the hatred of Haman for Mordecai. And so Haman decided that I'm going to get rid of not only Haman, but all of the Jewish people. But listen, he didn't understand that God had a plan, because it was through the Jewish people the Messiah would be born. The Messiah had not yet been born, but Jesus would be born through the lineage of David, through the seed of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And if Haman would have gotten his way, he would have exterminated every Jewish person that was in the known world. But God went through with the Jewish people. And I really want to stop and tell you that can't nobody destroy you until God gets through you. I don't care how hard they try. I don't care what they do to try to destroy you, to stop you, to exterminate you, to eliminate you. You can't be destroyed until God gets through doing with you what God wants to do through you. And so Haman decided, I'm going to get rid of all of them. I'm going to get rid of Haman, I'm going to get rid of Mordecai, and I'm going to get rid of the Jewish people. And so he went to the king and said, King, declare and start this decree that all the Jews of this land, this country, this world be destroyed. And Haman was so willing and said such hatred for the Jews, he says, I'll pay for anybody who kills a Jew. And that was his plan, to get rid of the Jewish people, simply because he hated one man. You don't know how people will destroy the whole thing because they don't like one person. They will tear down everything because they don't like one person. And his hatred was fueled for one man. And because of his hatred for one man, he was willing to destroy everybody associated with this man, everybody who was the same ethnicity of this man. But what he didn't count on was God. So I want to tell you that God showed up. God was very much active in this book. God was very much in this story. And I want to explain to you some lessons and some ideas of how you ought to view what God does in your life that you don't know he's doing. Brothers and sisters, sometimes God can be at work. God can be doing some stuff. He could be preserving you. He could be saving you. He could be holding you in reserve because he's not finished with you. I'm going to look at this particular text, and I don't want to do the whole story because I want to be very timely today, because I want you to get that it might be your time in your moment. My brothers and sisters, can I give you this definitive proclamation and declaration? You still here for a reason.
Yes, sir.
You are still here for a reason. There are people your age, people you grew up with, people you went to school with, people that you know very personally, people that you are kin to in your family. They gone, but you still here. You drove down the same highway they drove down. You had the same sickness they had. You had some of the same problems they had. You had to live in some of the same conditions that they had to live in, but they gone and you still here. And I argue to you this morning, it might be that God ain't finished with you yet. That God still has purpose for you. God still has a plan for you. God is still working on you. God is still working through you. And I want to stop right here and stick a pin. Sometimes God has you here because he's still working on you. You ain't ready to die. In other words, you ain't good enough for heaven, but you ain't bad enough for heaven. And so God keeps you here because he's still working on you, because he's getting you ready for heaven. And you ain't ready just yet. Sometimes God keeps you here not because he's just working on you, but he wants to work through you. It's still some stuff God wants to do through you. In other words, you're not disposable yet. You're not trash yet.
All right.
He's not finished with you yet. Now, other people might count you out, but God ain't finished. Other people might say that you're not useful to God, but God has the last say.
Come on, Pastor.
Right.
Put your weight on. Come on.
You're right, sweet.
Come on.
All right, sweet.
So let me just read a couple of verses, primarily verse 14. Because you can't preach "It's your time" or "Is it your time" in your moment without reading this verse in Esther chapter 4, verse 14. I mean, when I read this, it kind of opened my eyes. Kind of gave me a little hope.
All right.
Verse 14. If you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet, who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? That's a question. Who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? You may be seated. Mordecai is asking a question to Esther because Esther has risen to power. She rose to power because the queen Vesti refused to present herself to King Ahasuerus or Xerxes the First. She refused to come in and let him show her off. That's what he wanted to do. Many theologians believe that he wanted her to present herself in only her crown. He didn't want her to have on any clothes because he wanted to show her off. But Persian women had dignity. And this Persian queen Vesti was unwilling to be paraded among the men of the king's celebration and party. And so he dismissed her. And the men who were in his court says, listen, you're gonna have to deal with her. Because if you don't deal with her, we're gonna go home and our wives gonna act just like her. So you're gonna have to put her in check. Because if you let this go unchecked of her being disobedient to you, this stuff might catch on. And so they said, you're going to have to deal with it. And so he dismissed her and fired her as queen. And so they saw that King Ahasuerus was a little aggravated and irritated that his number one chick, he no longer had access to her. So they said, listen, you can replace her. And what we recommend is that you hold a beauty pageant and find the finest women, these at least 400 virgins, and we're going to have a beauty pageant. And among those women, you can find you a new queen. And the text says that they had this beauty pageant, and in the first round of this beauty pageant, Esther got noticed. If you read Esther, around chapter 2, she was fine in the face, and she was fine in the body. The text says the form of her face was fine, the form of her body was fine. She was a very attractive woman. Her beauty got her attention. The way she looked got her attention. It got her through the first round. And then they took the women who made it through the first round and they took them and moved them into the palace and all of their maid servants. And for about a year, they prettied them up even prettier. They gave them the best makeup and they bathed them and they pampered them and they massaged them. They made them even more beautiful. And then in the second round, she was noticed by the king. And the king said, this girl fine. And out of 400 women, the person who got noticed was Esther. So Esther became the queen. And so she enjoyed the privileges of being the queen, the privileges of having access. So now she's in the position of queen. She has access to the king. She lives in the palace. But now there's another story in the book of Esther that's unfolding. Wicked Haman wants to destroy the Jewish people. Mordecai refuses to bow, to give him deference and honor. He refuses to bow. And that story is unfolding. And so he comes up with this plot to destroy all the Jewish people. And Mordecai's heart is grieved. He takes off his clothes and puts some sackcloth in the ashes and just grieves. Many believe that the reason why Haman hated Mordecai was a long-standing feud between the king of Agag. Agag was the king that Saul spared. You remember in the book of Samuel, there was a nation that God wanted them to go in and to destroy, and God told them to kill everybody, everything, but Saul spared King Agag, the king of Agag. And many believe that Haman was a descendant of Agag, and here is Mordecai, a descendant of Samuel. So this was a long-standing feud, and so many believe Mordecai, the descendant of Samuel, refused to bow down to a descendant of Agag, and Agag wanted the Jewish man Mordecai to bow to him, but there was wasn't happening on either side. Wasn't nobody willing to give. Haman was unwilling to give Mordecai a pass. Said, listen, everybody else bows, you gonna bow. Every Persian bows to me. Every Jewish person bows to me. Everybody in and outside the king court bows to me. And so you're no different. You're gonna have to bow to me as well. But listen, Mordecai wasn't having any of that. And so he got his plot, he got a decree from the king, and the king gave him his signet ring. And he put it on express mail. He sent out letters to every province, every part of the kingdom, that on a certain day, the Jews would be killed and the people would have permission to kill any Jew. And not only would they have permission to kill them, but they get a reward for killing them. There was a bounty on their head. And Mordecai was distressed because of this decree. And Haman thought he had it made. He had gotten away with genocide of the Jewish people. In the meantime, Esther was in the palace, having access to the king, living pretty good. She was removed from this problem until word got to her through Mordecai. Through one of the servants got to her and told her the situation and why Mordecai was in distress. And so finally, the word got to Queen Esther, and then we see this conversation happens after they finally got together. And Esther says, really, what can I do about this problem? There's nothing I can do. And then Mordecai has to remind her, just maybe, the reason why you are where you are, have access that you have, is for a reason. Maybe there's a purpose behind you getting to where you have gotten. Out of 400 women, you were picked to be the new queen. Out of 400 women, you have this access to the king. And he says in the 14th verse of chapter 4, maybe, just maybe, you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Maybe the reason why you're here is purpose, is a plan. It might be unknown to you. You might not know how. You might not know why. But just consider that the how is God and the why is this. And my brothers and sisters, in every situation in your life, sometimes the how is God. The why is going to be unfolded and revealed to you. I want to give you about 4 things that I want you to consider, because in this particular book, you don't see the name of God mentioned, but let me tell you, God is in this book. God is in this story. God is working. And I want to give you 4 things in this particular book, and I want you to remember these about God. First of all, God can be working, but yet be unseen. God can be at work in your life, but yet he is unseen. In other words, you can't see God at work, but it doesn't mean that God isn't at work. God can be at work and you don't even see God at work. God can be at work but yet be unseen. We don't see the name of God mentioned in this book. We don't even see Mordecai calling on God. And sometimes we put God in the text, but Mordecai doesn't say to her, maybe God has put you in this place for such a time as this. He simply says, maybe you have come to this place. Or come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Now, my brothers and sisters, Mordecai wanted her to understand you didn't get here by happenstance. You didn't get here by accident, but maybe God got you here through circumstances that you really didn't understand. God can be at work and be unseen. Let me tell you, God can be at work and be unnoticed. You don't even understand that God is working. And you don't even notice that God is at work. He can be unseen, but he can be unnoticed. In other words, have you never asked the question how you got where you got? How you got what you got? And how this thing worked out the way it worked out in your life? How could you be so lucky? How could you be so fortunate to get where you have gotten, to have what you have, to have access to what you have access to? I mean, God can be at work and be unnoticed. He can be controlling what you don't notice that he's controlling. And my brothers and sisters, God can be at work and you don't even realize that he is working. You don't realize it in the present, but if you go further into the future and you look back into the future, you realize it was God. Because there is no explanation how you got to where you got, how you have what you have. If it had not been for the hand of God, you'd have never made it. God can be at work and go unseen and unnoticed. God can be quiet and yet be working. In other words, he can be silent. I mean, God can just let me tell you something. Don't get too upset or too alarmed when God is quiet. When it seems like God is doing nothing, because sometimes when God is doing nothing, that's when God is doing something. I wish I had time to preach on that. Because see, some people don't realize you want God to be loud because you loud. But sometimes God is not loud, God is quiet. God is silent, he's saying nothing. He is quiet, but sometimes when he is quiet is when God is working the most. And I need to tell you, in prayer, sometimes when God don't say nothing back, God is working things out. I wish I had time to preach on it. Sometimes you be praying and you be asking God to do something, you don't hear nothing back. But I can tell you in that silence, in that quietness, God is at work. Just because he's not answering you, just because he's saying nothing, doesn't mean he's not at work. And sometimes his silence means that he is working things out. In the quietness of your life.
Tell it, preacher. Come on. You own it. Come on.
your tears.
Yeah. Come on, Shannon. Come on, Shannon.
Come on, Pastor.
Yes, sir.
Sometimes
Yes, sir.
you in sackcloth and ashes, just like Mordecai. At the
Yeah.
gate, you're just paralyzed. You don't know what to do.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
And Mordecai was almost in panic mode because it looked like it wasn't going to work out. Because God was quiet
Yeah.
and God was silent.
Yeah.
I'm going to give you the fourth thing and I'm moving on. Sometimes God is working behind the scenes.
Yes, indeed.
See, you so used to things working out as you see them work out.
That's right.
Faith is the evidence of things not.
That's it. Yes, sir.
And see, this is really a shouting point.
Yes, sir.
Because sometimes God is working behind
Set it up, Pastor.
the scenes. In other words, you visually see me up here.
Yeah.
And I know I got problems you don't know I have.
Yes, sir. Set
And
it
see, I don't see God working them out with my eyes, and I don't hear God working them out with my ears. But just because I can't see or hear, and it doesn't look like things are being worked out, God is working out some things for me behind
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Behind the scenes.
behind the scenes. That's why Mordecai could say what he said in verse 14.
Yes, sir.
Because he understood that God was working things out before
Yeah.
All right.
Haman's actions. In other words, God anticipated what Haman was going to do. And so he had already put Esther in the kingdom. You got to know when to share.
Come on, Pastor.
In other words, God can anticipate a problem and already put people in place to deal with the problem. You don't know that it's going to be a problem down the road, but God knows. And so he be working things out. He be setting things up. He be putting people in places.
Yeah. Yeah.
God be working some things out
Yes, he is.
behind the scenes.
Tell it.
Come on, Pastor.
Tell it.
Because I'm going to tell you what it's done for me. It's caused me not to panic.
All right. Say it.
That's right.
Say it,
The
Pastor.
reason why Houston is in trouble because of this storm, because they didn't anticipate.
Yeah.
They couldn't see this storm coming. They had storms, but not storms like this storm.
Yeah.
But see, the same storm went to New York, but they were ready for the storm.
Yeah.
They had already experienced storms like this.
Yes, sir.
And so they had enough plows, they had enough salt, and what they didn't do in New York, they didn't shut down the city. But in Texas, this paralyzed the city. They were unprepared for this situation. But see, New York had already been working behind the scenes.
Set it up, Pastor.
And see, God already knows the snowstorm is coming.
Yeah.
And he already has snowstorm preparation plans already in place.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
All right now.
That's right.
And God is working behind the scenes in your life.
Yes, he is.
And you don't even know that he is. He already has a medicine for your sickness. He already has a plan for your financial struggle.
Yes, sir. Come on, Pastor.
He already has a solution to your loneliness.
Woo.
All right.
He already has healing for your despair.
Yeah.
You can't see it. You don't know that God has already worked things out.
Yeah. Come on, Pastor.
But behind the scenes,
Yes, sir.
the director of any movie
Uh-huh.
already knows how it's going to end. You don't know.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Right.
He just wrote the story so he could keep you watching until the end. And so you start watching the movie and you're intrigued and you clap and sometimes you cry. And sometimes you sit on the edge of your seat because you don't know what's going to happen. But the difference between you and the director wrote the movie.
Yeah.
He know the ebb and flow of the movie going to end in a certain way.
Yes, sir.
Because see, he's worked behind the scenes. He wrote the play. And he put in the play the ups, the downs, the tragedies, the celebrations, the difficulties. He knew.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Let me give you these 4 lessons, and I'm going to my seat.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes God works, and he's unseen, unnoticed, and he's quiet, and he works behind the scenes. Now, let me give you these 4 points, but I really want you to get these. God can work through a lot of different people.
Yes, yes, yes.
God can work through a lot of different people. Queen Vesta, God worked. She's in the story. The queen was in the. She had to lose in order for Esther to win. You'll get that on the way home.
That's right.
She had to lose in order for Esther to win. She had to have what she had taken away for Esther to get what she gained. And God used a lot of different people in order to do what he does. And he even used the king. The king's arrogance, his brashness. God used that. God used all kinds of different people. So don't dismiss people that come into your life. Whether good or bad, God has a plan. God can use them people to do something in your life that he's trying to do. And we're quick to dismiss people. We're quick to devalue people. We're quick to throw people away and to trash people. And sometimes people that come into our lives, they are in God's plan to get us to a certain place. Not everybody that God sends into our life is going to bless us. Sometimes those people make us cry, but yet God has purpose for them. God has a lesson that they are going to drop off to us as he gets us to where he is taking us. So don't dismiss every encounter with a person as a chance encounter. Sometimes that person has a purpose. And Tyler Perry says there's sometimes God sends people in your life to come through your life, to stay in your life, to teach your life a lesson, or sometimes just to get a little lesson. They are temporary, but always be aware that God uses different kinds of people at different times in your life to deposit into your life something.
All right. All right.
It takes all kinds of people sometimes for God to do what God's going to do in your life. And sometimes the hellions and the most difficult people are necessary in order for God to do what God's going to do. And you dismiss them. Some people you want to get rid of, keep them around. Some God wants to teach you. God wants to show you. God wants to reveal something. God used all kinds of people and worked through different people. All of these people in this story. The eunuch that got her noticed. He noticed her before the king noticed her. He helped her to get ready to be presented before the king. She was noticed by him, and he got her ready. And then some people don't play a big role. They play a small role, a significant role. Blasey Boyd is a member of this church, and the meditation garden is named in her honor. Many of you don't know who she is, but boy, she played a big part in us having this renovated sanctuary. One of the people who stood up and spoke up and said we need to move forward. And she was very significant. She did not get to enjoy it, to see it, but God used her in a significant way. There are people, you might not count their contribution as great, but they do drop something off to you that you need to get to the next level in your life. God uses all kinds of different kinds of people. Let me give you this. God works through a lot of different circumstances. Not only people, but circumstances. Now, my brothers and sisters, this is so significant and important because there are some circumstances that you try to avoid. Some circumstances you try to get out of. Some situations that are so stressful to you, they cause you so much stress. But I need to drop this off and tell you, sometimes the stressful circumstances you are put in, God allows you to be in, is getting you ready for the next level. In other words, God will put you in some mess to get you ready for some mess, to get you through some mess. I just said something. You are dealing with some difficult situations, some difficult circumstances, and those difficult circumstances is the classroom for you to learn and to take some tests, to pass some tests, to be promoted to the next level. In other words, you go through some high school experience to get some collegiate training. And the collegiate training gets you to the next level. But don't ever dismiss the elementary problems that come up in your life. Those circumstances are preparing you for bigger mess, stickier mess, harder mess, darker mess. God is always preparing you for what has not yet happened in your life. So don't dismiss the trivial, small circumstances that are difficult in your life, because sometimes they are getting you ready for something great. Every bad relationship you've ever been through is getting you ready for the relationship that's going to be your permanent relationship. Every heartbreak is preparing you for something. Every circumstance in your life.
Yes, sir.
God is using it.
Yes, he is.
I really wish I had time to explain this principle to you, but I know Ernestine understands this because she's a fitness fanatic. That the weights that she uses and that people who work out use is heavy, but it makes you stronger. And the tighter you get, the more stress you put on your muscles, the more stronger your muscles become.
Say it, Pastor. Yes, sir. Tell me the
And
truth.
see, we think weight is to hurt us. The strain and struggle is to hurt us, but it ain't to hurt us, it's to
No,
make
sir.
us.
No, sir.
I wish I had time to explain this principle. I'm going to say it one more time because I've said it 100 times. Do not believe the statement that God will never put more on you than you can bear. That's the biggest false statement that has ever been made in the Christian church. Because sometimes he will put more on you than you can bear to make you stronger. Sometimes he'll put more on you than you can bear to teach you a lesson. Sometimes he'll put more on you than you can bear so you can ask him for help. Sometimes he'll put more on you than you can bear so you can help ask people for help, but he will put more on you than you can bear.
Yes, sir.
He'll put some stuff on you. He'll put you through some stuff.
Yes, sir.
Every circumstance in life, God has a plan. God has a purpose for that situation. And God was at work in this story. These circumstances didn't happen because, listen, what if in this story Mordecai wouldn't have had favor with the king? Because I need to tell you that Mordecai was sitting at the gates one day and two of the king's eunuchs were talking about a plot to kill the king. And Mordecai overheard it. And so he reported it to the king through Esther. And one night the king went to bed and he slept and he couldn't sleep. And so he says, go get the chronicles of the kings and everything that was happening in the kingdom that had anything to do with the king. They wrote it down. And so he asked for the books of the chronicles of kings to be read to him because he couldn't sleep. And they were reading it to him. And he read a part in there where Mordecai had saved his life. There was a plot against the king's life. And Mordecai overheard the two men who plotted this overthrow or this assassination of the king. And so he reported it and the king remembered it. But you're going to see how that works out in the story, because as the story unfolds, you remember that old wicked Haman who wanted to destroy. He wanted to get rid of Mordecai because he hated him so much. And the king remembered the heroic work of Mordecai. And then one day he called in Haman and said, man, what should I do for a man who has shown great valor and courage, a man who saved my life, a man who was very instrumental in me still being here? I could have been taken out by these two men who were plotting my assassination, but the heroics of the man that I'm talking about, he deserves to be honored. And he asked Haman, what should I do for this man? And Haman said, you should get him on a horse, and you should get him a royal robe, and get him some royal a crown, and put him on a horse, and you should get somebody to lead him around. And let me tell you, my brothers and sisters, what Haman didn't understand, that it was Mordecai that the king was talking about. In other words, God will use people who try to destroy you to elevate you. He will use them to get you where he was trying to get you in the first place. And so the king says, you're exactly right. That's exactly what I'm going to do for this man. I'm going to get him a horse. I'm going to put him on some crown jewels, put him on a robe. I'm going to have somebody to lead him all around the city. As a matter of fact, Haman, you take that job. He was wanting to destroy Mordecai. He had built some gallows to hang Mordecai because he hated Mordecai. And now the very man he wanted to destroy, he is now leading him around the city on a horse with royal clothes and royal jewels. It's right here in the story.
That's all right.
That's right, Doctor.
From hanging him on the gallows to leading him on the horse. The humiliation. You better be careful who you want to take down. You better be careful who you plot to bring down. Because you might be the very person God uses to take them to a place of celebration, adoration. You might be the catalyst in which God uses to put them every circumstance. Every circumstance. Now, Mordecai didn't know that saving the king's life was going to get him in this position. But I wish I could hurry on and give you a little bit about the story at the end, because after the plot and Haman was eventually hung on the same gallows that he wanted to hang Mordecai on, the signet ring of Haman was given to Mordecai. And the possessions of Haman was much, and it was given to Esther. The man who had it all had nothing. God uses every circumstance. Listen, let me give you this next one. The third thing, God can be saving you for the right time.
Amen. Amen.
It just ain't your time right now. Quit hating. Quit being impatient. Quit trying to hurry God up. Quit trying to hurry things up. Quit trying to hurry people up. It's just not your time. Quit hating on her because she found a man. It just ain't your time. Quit hating on them because they got a new house, a new car, a better. It ain't your time. Timing is everything. And let me tell you, what you don't control is time. You don't control when God is going to do what God is going to do in your life.
Yes, sir.
It just might not be your time. Because many scholars believe that Esther had been queen for about 5 years, and for 5 years she played no significant role as queen. But at this moment, in chapter 4, verse 14, her purpose for getting where she had gotten was unfolding. Right person, right time, at the right moment. God might be saving you for the right time. And see, you trying to make noise too early. It ain't your time. And so don't rise to the top too early. Don't get out front too early. Don't try to be out too early. God could be saving you for the right time. Let me give you this, and I ain't got one more. God is going to get you noticed when you need to be noticed.
That's right.
I don't know what it is about us. We don't like to just wait. When God gets ready for you to be noticed, you ain't got to do nothing to get noticed or to be noticed. He just gonna make you know. I really don't have two illustrations, and I'm gonna go to my seat when I explain these to you. Now listen, Moses wasn't the only leader. He wasn't the only servant of God. But God picked him. Now God could have called him when he was in the palace of Pharaoh. But he didn't call him until he got on the backside of the desert. He didn't call Moses when he was on the top of his game. But he called him after he had made a mistake, killed an Egyptian, thought he was doing a noble thing, and the very Egyptians he was trying to defend, they turned him in. And outed him. And so he had to go on a run, and it wasn't until he showed up on the backside of the desert, keeping Jethro's sheep, that the Lord showed up in the form of a burning bush. Now God did not get him noticed when he was in the palace, and he was because he was already in Egypt before he went back to Egypt. But never when he was in Egypt did God get him noticed. He didn't bring any attention to him. We know the story because of what Moses' mother did and Moses' sister did, but he really wasn't noticed by God. God was working every circumstance to get him back to Egypt. But when he was in Egypt, he was never noticed by Pharaoh. He was never noticed by the Egyptians. But at the right time, God said, now it's time to go back.
All right.
And when he went back this time, he was the center of attention. He was the star of the show. Not when he wanted to be, but when God got a time now.
Yes, he do.
See, you think you ought to be out front now. Not now. See, God got to work some things out. He's got to manipulate some circumstances. God got to get some people in place.
Yes, sir. Say it, Pastor.
And one of the things that Exodus says that there was a Pharaoh who came to power who didn't know Joseph's God. Sometimes God will get some crazy people in charge, and then he'll call you. Then he'll decide to use you. He'll get you noticed when it's his time, not your time.
All right, say that.
I got one more person to give you. Mary, the mother of Jesus.
Come on, Pastor.
She wasn't the only virgin
Yeah.
in Bethlehem, in Nazareth.
Yeah.
But she was the one God chose.
Yeah.
Not for any particular reason, just she had favor.
Yeah.
She found favor. In other words, she got God's attention, and then when she got God's attention, God got her noticed by everybody. And she probably didn't want the attention she got because she was engaged. Joseph had borrowed with her father a price to have her hand in marriage. He had paid the dowry. Her life was going along well. She had the perfect husband. She had an agreement between the in-laws of the price of a virgin. And Joseph was happy. He had planned. He had went back home to build a house onto his father's house so that him and Mary could have a dwelling place. Life was good. And then God showed up.
Yeah.
Stepped into this.
Yes, sir. Show up.
And God stepped into her situation in her life without an invitation. God did not send a message to her and said, I'm coming.
No, sir. No, he didn't.
God just showed up
Yeah.
out of nowhere.
That's what he did.
And really wish I had time to explain to you the Immaculate Conception. And that literally means that God put a baby in her before he got her permission. God had already placed the seed in her womb.
Yeah.
God had already impregnated her. He had already chosen her. He had taken away from her choice.
Yeah.
Because God got it like that.
Yes, sir. Say it.
God don't need your permission to birth something in your life that's going to work for his good
Yeah.
and for his glory.
Yeah.
He can do some things in your life without your permission because he has a sovereign will.
Yes, he do. You own it, man. You own it.
And God got her notice. Now, I need to tell you, sometimes God can get you notice for all the wrong reasons.
Tell the truth, man. Tell the truth.
Because she got notice for all the wrong reasons. First of all, Joseph
Yeah.
thought he was buying a virgin
Uh-huh.
who had never been touched.
Uh-huh.
And then her father thought he was giving in marriage a girl who was pure
Yeah. Yeah.
and married her.
Yeah.
Everything is perfect.
Yeah.
God doesn't always use good circumstances to get you noticed. Sometimes out of mess,
Woo. Get to know. Get to know.
difficulties and trouble, he can get you
Come on, God.
get you noticed. In other words, your playboy reputation can get sometimes get you noticed by the right one.
Yeah. Say it, Pastor.
All right now, all right.
Not good, but bad.
Yes, sir.
All right now, come on, baby.
Let me give you this one more before I show off your hand.
No, come on.
Can I give you this last one?
Yeah.
Nobody can stop God's plan.
Yes, sir. Say it, Pastor.
I mean, when he decides to do something, you might get in my way, but you can't get in God's way.
No, no.
I saw one caricature of a cartoon of a boulder rolling down a hill and a man going up the hill trying to stop that boulder.
Tell it, ain't no way.
Ain't no way.
You better say it.
That man gonna lose.
Yes, sir.
And any man that run up that hill trying to stop that boulder from coming down that hill gone. Old folk didn't have a lot of theological training, but they simply said your hands are too short to box with God.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
There's a whole lot of folk that's in the Bible that tried to stop it. I got the two of them, and I promise I'm finished. Two people. God had a plan, and you remember that old Pharaoh. So wait a minute, I'm God. And you go back and tell him, he gave some orders and got a plan, but you go back and tell him, Moses, I ain't doing nothing. I ain't letting nobody go. And Moses reported back to the Lord and said, that man do said he ain't letting nobody go. And the Lord said, okay, you step back.
Yeah. Yes,
You
sir.
done your job. I'm finna do mine. In that story, God attacked all of the gods, little g o d s,
Yes. Hey, Pastor.
of Egypt. Sent 10 plagues. And then the final plague was Pharaoh, because you know Pharaoh was a god in the eyes of the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Because you remember when they had made it out of Egypt, on their way to the promised land, they made it to the Red Sea, and God opened the Red Sea by miraculous miracles in the east, west, north winds, and not only did it part the Red Sea, but it dried up the land, and they were on their way across. And the text says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. See, this was God dealing with the last God.
Yeah.
The ultimate God, the final God, the man who thought he was God. And they were crossing, and they looked back, and Pharaoh in his arms thought they had him trapped at the Red Sea. And they started panicking and crying out to Moses. And the Lord faxed in a message to Moses and told him, said, be still and see the salvation of the Lord. These Egyptians you see this day, you ain't gonna see them no more.
All right.
The children of Israel made it over to the other side of the Red Sea, and Pharaoh decided, listen, I'm finna borrow from God's miracle. I'm going to. And that old Negro spiritual saying, Pharaoh drowned in the Red Sea. See, that was God showing his superior power. One more. Moses, but now listen. The Apostle Paul was the man who held the cloaks of those who stoned Stephen. And this very vicious and hateful man, he hated the Christian church. He held the cloaks of those who stoned Stephen, and he was a persecutor of the church and thought he couldn't be broken. Thought he was such a bad man. I'm saying Paul was mean, hateful, vindictive. He thought he was smart and powerful. Thought he couldn't be broken. He describes himself that way. I'm not making any imagination up about Paul. But on the Damascus Road, he ran into God. Because God had a plan for the life.
Yes, sir.
And see, in Pharaoh's incident, he destroyed Pharaoh. But in Paul's incident, he wanted to use it. The worst of us. And God stopped him. Knocked him off of his beast. Blinded him. And I just want one statement out of that Damascus Road experience. And you know what the Lord told him? Says, Paul is hard to kick against the prick. The prick was a sharp object that they would use to prod the camels to make them go left, right, to get into the stables, to go through a chute, and to keep them from turning back and going in the direction they wanted them to go. They would use this prick, and the prick would hurt. If you're going in the direction and it's hurting you, maybe you need to go in the opposite direction. Maybe if you're experiencing a lot of pain trying to do what you want to do, maybe you need to consider an alternative route.
That's right.
Do something else.
That's right.
Because that might not be where God wants you to be, and he might be using the prick. Because God will always
Yes, sir. Oh,
get his Nobody stopped the plans of God, and I gotta just mention Jesus on my way to my seat. You know, that he said, if you destroy this temple in 3 days, I'll raise it up again.
Woo! Yes, sir.
Now let me tell you, the Jews thought that Jesus' death was going to be the end of Jesus. You know, they killed him with a plan of swatting out and smashing out his movement.
Yeah.
They thought that if they killed Jesus, he would be less effective. His followers would be in despair. They would fall apart. The Christian movement, this salvation by grace, would be over. They had the intention of killing Jesus and killing the movement of Jesus.
All right now. Like it is, sweetie.
We get rid of Jesus, we can stop all this nonsense.
Sure enough.
So they crucified him.
They tried. Right.
But they didn't take serious when he said, destroy this temple in 3 days.
Yeah.
And then they didn't listen to that part that says, if I be lifted up,
Yes, sir.
I'll draw all men
Okay.
unto me. God had a plan. And listen, the Jews couldn't get in the way of God's plan.
No, sir.
The Romans who carried out the execution couldn't get in the way of God's plan. The disciples who denied and abandoned him couldn't get in the way of God's plan. The devil, who was Jesus' arch enemy, couldn't get in the way of God's plan. Death itself couldn't get in the way of God's plan. The grave couldn't get in the way of God's plan. And when they nailed him to the cross, death
Yes, sir.
couldn't hold him.
Oh, yeah.
The grave couldn't contain him. Got up! It was almost like one Negro preacher said that the earth couldn't take it, so they vomited him up. God the Son couldn't be contained in the earth he created.
Yes, sir.
Burst
Yeah.
and came out
Yeah.
and stood up on resurrection ground.
Say it. Come on, preacher.
You got to understand what that means, Michael. Now, he was in a cemetery.
Yeah.
And they didn't bury him under the ground, but they buried him in a crypt. It was a place of death.
Yes, sir.
But he turned a cemetery, a place where the dead rested.
Yeah.
He turned it into resurrection ground.
Yeah. Go ahead, preacher. All right now.
Somebody need to shout right now.
Go ahead.
Because it looked like you in a dead place. But he turned that dead place into resurrection ground.
Yeah. Go ahead, preacher.
Declared that all power
Yes, sir.
is in my hand.
Yeah. All right, preacher.
And listen, I can't finish the story right there. He got up,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
but about 40 days later,
Yes, sir.
not only did he get up,
Yeah.
but he went up.
Yes, sir.
He ascended back to
Yeah.
the Father,
Yes, sir.
took his position at the right hand.
Yes, sir. Yes, he did. Yes, he did.
God got his son back.
Yeah.
John 3:16 says, for God so loved the world
Yes, sir.
that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever believes,
Yes, sir.
died,
Yeah.
got up,
Yes, sir.
now he's going up. No wonder Stephen said,
Yeah.
as he was dying,
Yeah.
when he looked up in the glory,
Yes, sir.
that he saw Jesus
Yeah.
standing at the right hand He will bring you through,
Yes, he will.
bring you out. Do I have any witnesses in here? Your tears are just
Yes, sir.
temporary.
Yes, sir.
Your tears are just a release of the pain
Yes, sir.
and the sorrow and the grief you bear. But don't worry,
My God.
God is going to wipe all your tears
Yes, he will.
away.
Yes, he will.
So don't worry. You won't have to cry no more.
No, sir.
God gonna wipe all
Yeah.
your tears.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
The door of the church is open.
Yeah.
The door is open.